Good evening. I understand that the skies have just opened up and poured on anybody who's unfortunate enough to be outside at this moment. So we might have some people trickling in, and be patient with them. So they're probably going to be soaked. Yeah. Welcome. My name's Lou Ann Roth. I teach at URI here in the Department of Writing and Rhetoric, and I've had the pleasure of serving on the planning committee for this colloquium, which has been great for networking and learning about all kinds of things that I wouldn't have otherwise learned about. I have some housekeeping issues to start with, as we always do. So the first thing is to remind you where the exits are. So there's exits here and also there, and then of course the doors that you came in the back. The bathrooms are 2 bathrooms in the back there. Also, please no photographs or recording devices for this evening. And to start off, I would like to introduce Wanda Hopkins to do our land acknowledgement. Wanda is an active citizen of the Narragansett Nation. She's a member of the Narragansett Indian Church. She serves on URI's Native American Advisory Council, which was successful in acquiring tuition waivers for all Narragansett citizens at URI. Yeah, and finally, Wanda's worked at URI for 7 years, and she's currently pursuing a master's in English. So, well, Wanda, please.
Asko Wakwasin Natapawag. Hello, friends. Natasawis Wanda Hopkins. I'm Wanda Hopkins from the Narragansett Nation. I give honor to my ancestors today. I give honor to the present Native people in our community who maintain our sovereignty, make sure our ways are here for the future. I give honor to the future generations who will also continue to make sure that Indigenous people have a presence here in Rhode Island and all over Turtle Island. Wanatikon, may peace be in our hearts.
Right, and now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. As a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe, Chef Sherman was born and raised in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Cooking in kitchens across the US and Mexico for over 30 years, Chef Sean is renowned nationally and internationally. His primary focus is the revitalization and evolution of Indigenous food systems throughout North America. His research has led to an understanding of what is needed to showcase Native American cuisine in today's world. In 2014, Chef Sean opened the business The Sous Chef, which was designed to provide catering and food education in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. With his business partner, Dana Thompson, Chef Sean designed and opened the Tatanka Truck, which features 100% pre-contact foods of the Dakota and Minnesota territories. That is, no fry bread or Indian tacos, amongst other things. In 2017, Chef Sean and his team presented the first decolonized dinner at the prestigious James Beard House in Manhattan. In 2018, his first book, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, received the James Beard Award for Best American Cookbook and was chosen as one of the top 10 cookbooks that year by the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and Smithsonian Magazine. One can see why. With its mouth-watering images and information about pre-contact Indigenous foods, Chef Sean encourages us to try our own hands at cooking this food, and in doing so, helps us to imagine a culture and world before the devastating effects of colonization. In 2021, Chef Sean and his partner Dana opened Owamni by the Sioux Chef, Minnesota's first full-service Indigenous restaurant, which features healthy Indigenous food and drinks, and which received the James Beard Award for Best New Restaurant in 2022. The Sioux Chef team continues with their mission to help educate and make Indigenous foods more accessible through their nonprofit arm called North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, or cleverly the acronym NATIVS. NATIVS, I thought it was clever. And the accompanied Indigenous Food Lab Professional Kitchen and Training Center. Working to address the economic and health crises affecting Native communities by reestablishing Native foodways, this training center imagines a new North American food system that both generates wealth and improves health in Native communities. On this cold and blustery evening, please help me give Chef Sean Sherman a warm Rhode Island welcome.
Thank you. All right. Hatia tuashte, haumatakyape, wambli watakpe anichapi. My name is Sean Sherman. I am from the Pine Ridge Reservation. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux Tribe. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, just double checking. And, you know, I'm just going to kind of take you guys through this talk that I like to do. I've been working in this realm for quite a few years. I opened up my company in 2014. But before that, it had come from quite a few years of trying to research. So I'm just going to talk to you about the work that we do, why we do the work that we do, kind of address the issue as why we don't see Native American restaurants all over the place as being very normal, and what we can do about that moving forward, and why Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous education is important to us. And oops, give me a second while I try and reconnect. Maybe not work. Lost my connection, technical difficulty, sorry. And one moment. There we go. So, anyways, we have been doing this work for quite a few years now, and it's been a pretty interesting ride. You know, we have had the food truck, and we did launch the restaurant. We did get the cookbook out. There is another cookbook in the works. I've done this talk quite a bit over the years, and I'm always excited just to get to a new place, a new university, and speak with students, speak with faculty, and just learn about all the different regions that we get to go and experience, and all the different food systems that are out there. So for my story, I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation, and dang it, I keep losing my connection here. But Pine Ridge Reservation is pretty large. It's in that yellow square. The last treaty that the United States government made with my tribe basically covered all that area in orange in 1868, I believe. But Pine Ridge Reservation is roughly the size of Connecticut, except for we have one grocery store to service the entire population there. I'm pretty sure there's more than one grocery store in Connecticut giving access to foods. So a lot of this work that I'm trying to do is really just trying to address some of the issues that are out there when it comes to food access and health issues. Because a lot of people on the reservation, just like myself growing up, we didn't have access to healthy foods. We had a lot of commodity foods, and it took hours to get to any place. If we had to go to Rapid City or something, it took a long, long time just to get there. I'm going to keep losing this. One second, I'm just having issues with this. Try this one. So, and on Pine Ridge, you know, typically and historically it's been, I would say, when I was born in 1974, we were probably 94% unemployment rate on the reservation. And today we're probably still in the 80 percentile, which isn't that good. So we didn't even have restaurants growing up. We had We had to drive out of the state to Nebraska, or we had to drive to Rapid City, South Dakota, or to the Black Hills to get that access of any kind of restaurants. So I was lucky because I grew up on a ranch, so I spent a lot of time outdoors. South Dakota is very open. There's a lot of big skies. There's the Badlands, which is this really unique area, is right there. And we spent a lot of time outside. We were just feral, especially in the 70s on the reservation. The parents didn't give us a lot of rules. They're basically just sent us outside with the dogs. And I always tease my dad a little bit just because, some people say like, oh, forgive me, I was raised by boomers. I was like, boomers didn't really raise us, they just kicked us outside. They didn't really do anything for us that much. So I'm going to have to try and switch to, AV, can we try and switch to this because I keep losing this connection. I get a little technical assistance here real quick. Just plug this in and hopefully that'll work. Thanks and sorry. All right, this should be a little bit better, more stable connection for us as we're kind of going through this. But anyways, for me, growing up on Pine Ridge Reservation, I didn't really know that much about food because we just didn't have restaurants, like I said. And then it wasn't until I started cooking a little bit later, my mom moved us off the reservation and we moved to a small town in the Black Hills called Spearfish, and I started working lots of touristy restaurants. I think my first restaurant was a mining-themed restaurant. And it was called the Sluice, which is this little chute that they would send all the soil and water down to try and collect all the little gold bits. And I just remember it had a mining-themed salad bar, mining cart salad bar or something like that. But I just grew up with a lot of steakhouses. That was kind of South Dakota at the time. And after, I just worked restaurants all through high school and college. I went to college there in Spearfish also at a university called Black Hills State. And then I moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I didn't really know that much about Minneapolis, except for that's where Prince lived and the replacements were there. And that was pretty much all I really knew at the time. But it was a cool city, and I just jumped right into the food scene in Minneapolis, and I started working restaurants, kept working restaurants, and I started learning a lot more because it was a city, so I just was picking up a lot more stuff than I could have in South Dakota. And Minneapolis was cool, and my chef career was great, and I moved my way up into a chef position at a pretty young age. It was a few years into that chef career that I kind of had the epiphany of doing what I'm doing now, because I realized the complete absence of my own culture in the food. There were no native restaurants, there was very few books on the subject, and it just was so invisible. So the question was really why? Why aren't native foods a thing? I grew up on a reservation, and why didn't I even know that much about my own Lakota foods? Because I started asking around, and I just couldn't find anything. And I would tease early on that I couldn't just go online and order Joy of Native American Cooking, because that doesn't exist. And I had to figure it out, So I asked a lot of my family members, a lot of elders in my community. I did a lot of research, but even the elders in my community went through boarding school systems and had lost a lot of information already at that point. So there was still a lot of missing. So for me, I just had to really dig in and go into the history of everything, of why aren't there Native American foods out there? And the more I learned about my tribe, because I was really curious, what were my ancestors eating? What were they harvesting? Which kind of plants were they utilizing? What kind of animals? Were they growing things? Were they trading with other tribes? I just wanted to know everything that they were doing in their food systems from that perspective of the kitchen and the foods. And it took a long time. It took me quite a few years of just self-studying and researching to try and understand, all of those pieces. And eventually, I just started doing it. I just started creating dinners and making foods and dinners. One of the first dinners I did was in northern Minnesota back in 2012 probably, and was an Anishinaabe taste of spring. So I knew that my ancestors had a vast knowledge of wild foods. I knew that there was just all sorts of amazing flavors, and I know people had been living here for thousands and thousands of generations that people were obviously eating a lot of food, and a lot of good food, and I wanted to find out what those pieces were. And the more I learned about my region, the more I kept going outwards, and today we look at North America, so we're looking at Mexico all the way through Alaska, and just trying to understand the immensity of the indigenous diversity that's out there, at the same time just really focusing on commonalities that indigenous peoples have with their food systems, and just realizing the full health benefit of going back to indigenous foods. And it's also even bigger than that when it comes down to it. When I was first starting the sous chef, people would always ask me, what are indigenous foods? And what does that even mean to people? Because people would be like, oh, Native American food, I never heard of it. What is it? And I would get that question a lot. But I feel like we're slowly getting there, little by little, that we're seeing a lot more Native chefs, like my friend Sherry, who's in the crowd, and she has Sly Fox Den. And it's an exciting time because we went through a lot as indigenous peoples, and there should be Native American restaurants in every single region, in every single city, just showcasing and highlighting the immense diversity, the amazing cultures that are out there, the languages, the foods, the histories and stories, mythology, everything. Like, there's so much amazing stuff to share, So it's just important as I started really researching, I started realizing what really happened to us as indigenous peoples too. And that's the big reason there aren't Native American restaurants everywhere. So I think it's really important to understand that no matter where we are in North America, we're standing on indigenous land spaces, and all of North American history begins with indigenous history. And I think it's a really important point to know as we kind of move forward. So I just wanted to know, what happened? What did we lose as indigenous people? Because I realized that, oops, I keep moving forward with you guys. Sorry, I'm using two machines at the same time. But anyways, what happened to these indigenous foods, and what did we lose as indigenous peoples? And how far back in my family history did it even go? How deep did I have to dig? I didn't have to dig very deep because I was born in 1974, 100 years prior to my birth in 1874. All my Lakota ancestors still retained 100% of their indigenous knowledge and education because they don't discover gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota until 1876, and that's when things go south really fast for my tribe. And then so why did we lose so much within a single century, less than 100 years? How did we lose? And what did we lose on top of that? So when I first started doing this work, I started cutting out colonial ingredients just to showcase there was so much amazing flavor around here. So I started using a lot of wild foods, digging around and trying to find Native American seed keepers and utilizing Native American products, heirloom Native American products that are still out there, utilizing wild game. I think game is an easy one, and just really trying to feature what was here and cutting out the colonial ingredients. So I cut out things like dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, Jell-O molds, and I just really wanted to understand, what all this meant. And how do we move forward? So I also realized that people just didn't really know that much about history when it comes down to it. So when I was using terms like decolonizing plates and pre-colonial foods, that I realized people didn't know what that meant. So I always like to start at the base because it's an important lesson to learn to understand indigenous foods to go from here. So what are pre-colonial foods? What does that term mean? So to really understand it, the easiest way to understand it, well, you have to first understand what does the word colonialism mean, right? So the easiest way to understand colonialism is to Google it. And if you Google that term, you're going to get this: the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So this isn't something that is unique to North America, because this has happened all over the globe in a very, very short time period in human history. So it's affected indigenous peoples on a global scale, from North America, Central America, South America, Africa, India, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, everywhere basically, right? And you have to understand how, in this very short time period of human history, how much damage and trauma and violence happened against indigenous peoples on a global scale. Because it all really starts, especially with the European powers, with the doctrine of discovery, which basically gave everybody the okay that if you discover something, you get to keep it, right? And it also just solidified that they would say if they weren't Christian, they don't have a soul, so they're not human, so they were justifying the use of slavery at that time period. So this is a really damaging situation for Indigenous peoples on a global scale, because we wander into an era of centuries of racism and white supremacy that we're still living amongst right now. We haven't even actually got through this phase. And we know a little bit about the history of enslaved people in the United States and globally, but people don't talk too often about the indigenous enslavement that happens here in the United States also, where over 5.5 million people were also part of that slave trade during that time period. And we have to remember like how little history the United States actually has. Because if you look at the United States, just starting at the year 1800, we're not that large. We're not much more than the original 13 colonies. Ohio is the western frontier at this time period. We're still at war with Great Britain. And, this isn't ancient history. This is 1800. There's buildings on this campus probably, or I'm sure there's buildings around this area older than that right here, right? I'm assuming. And, so again, we have to remember how little history we have in the United States. And, one of the things that really sets the pace for the United States to move forward is the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which justifies what to do with indigenous land spaces, because they discover early on by acquiring indigenous land spaces that they can commodify it, parcel it, sell it, and the United States government makes an immense amount of money selling stolen indigenous land spaces, which it continues to do throughout the rest of that century. And we have to also realize that at that time period in U.S. and just in the history of things, that the reality is that all the indigenous communities living across this land space, most of them haven't even seen European people at this phase in time. And they're still stewarding all of this land space, even though European powers have cut huge swaths of spaces and claimed it, The reality is that it's still occupied by indigenous peoples, and our history books don't like to talk about that part of how many indigenous communities were out there during these time histories, right? And we don't even really see the form of what we know today as the United States until the middle of that century, until after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, where they finally formed the southern border of what is the U.S. and Mexico today. But we have to just realize this one century between 1800 and 1900 is really intense, extremely violent towards indigenous peoples. And the United States government has never come to terms with the violence that it utilized against indigenous peoples, or the violence it used with indigenous peoples stolen from Africa, forced to build so much of what is here today. And during this one century, we see so much loss of land so quickly. California wipes out its entire indigenous population almost to completion within just a decade between the just throughout the 1860s. And so at the beginning of that century, over 300,000 indigenous peoples or more living around what is California. By 1873, they do a census and less than 14,000 are left, and it's largely because of a bounty system that was the new formed California government pays, so you can make up to $200 for the body part of an indigenous person during that time period. And just a lot of immense violence. So at the end of that century, only 2% of that landmass is held by indigenous peoples only because of the reservation systems. So during this time period, the full colonial machine is in effect, right? It's always extraction for profit. So we see settlers coming in, we see an immense amount of mining, logging, situations like that, extracting whatever they might deem valuable, leaving in waste the environment. And we've seen this in the West a lot because it's just really, the whole environment changes during this one century across the board. And it's not like what indigenous peoples have lived with, because if you can imagine what some of the Western forests would have looked like with all old growth trees, just forests and forests, all completely ripped down. Less than 10% of the redwoods still stand today of the original ones, because the colonizers never took to learn the lessons of the indigenous peoples who had been living with them for millennia and knew how to live and work with them perfectly in building, houses as big as this theater, utilizing those trees. and instead just ripping them down to where there's almost nothing left of them. And we also see just an intense loss and destruction of crops and seeds. We really have no idea how many species, heirloom varietals of corns and beans and squash and sunflower seeds, and who knows what else was lost during this time period in this 1 century. Our first president, George Washington, right after he is elected, or while he's president, one of his first acts is sending General Sullivan out to destroy and get rid of all the native nations that are up in the Northeast, because he was upset that they were siding with the British. Because the British, they felt like the British were safer. They didn't really trust this young government that was forming at that time. So George Washington orders the total destruction and devastation of settlements and capture and enslavement of everybody as possible. So General Sullivan sets out that summer in 1779 and does just that. It only takes him a single summer between May and September to accomplish that. And at the end of that, he writes back to George Washington and says, there's not a single site of an Indian on this side of Niagara, because everybody escapes and moves up. And today in Haudenosaunee, the word for U.S. president still means town destroyer because of that very situation. And this just basically sets the tone for the rest of the century. And we just see a lot of acts coming from the United States government against indigenous peoples, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830 under Andrew Jackson, which is better known as the Trail of Tears, which is extremely violent. And then we also have things like the Morrill Act of 1862, which actually, this university is a land-grant university, and it's a direct privilege from this situation signed under President Lincoln, because basically it's justifying the use of stolen native land and applying it to territories so that they can start universities and colleges, particularly around agriculture. So I did a little research, and Brown University was the first land grant in Rhode Island, actually, but then they didn't quite qualify, but the new college here of agriculture at that time period did, so they became the land grant university here. And I also did the research of which land they utilize. So they utilized about 160,000 or 140,000 acres from land in Kansas, and I did the research on one of those land spaces, and 40,000 acres of that land were taken from the Kansa people, or Ka. And I did a little bit more research, and it said that the United States government gave them an offer, but they refused, so they forced to take it. And they paid them $179 for 40,000 acres. So I did that math, and that was just shy of less than a half a penny per acre. And and if you do the math, like what is that in today's dollars? That's about 10 cents an acre in inflation in today's money. Whereas today, like the inflation of the average price of an acre in Kansas is $2,000, right? So the United States government did this kind of situation and over for people, and there's a lot of land grant universities out there because a lot of states have them, but they're still getting direct privileges from a lot of this situation in the mid-1800s. And I just think it's really important to know those histories. And I just feel like there should be some obligation in the future at some point for some of these universities to really make an effort to try and support as much indigenous progress as possible, especially when it comes to food systems, especially because they're designed to be agricultural spaces for learning, right? Indigenous people shouldn't be having to pay for education, which some universities are moving forward with, but I just think there's a lot we can do when it comes to it. We also see things like the Homestead Act at the same time of 1862, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871, the Dawes Act of 1887, and all of these pieces are designed to weaken indigenous peoples, justify land grabbing of indigenous land spaces, and to further take away rights from indigenous peoples as the century goes on. During this time period, we also see a really intense treatment of indigenous peoples trying to stand up for their lives and livelihood and cultures. And this is a picture of a concentration camp right outside of Minneapolis. And this was after the Dakota people tried to rise up to fight for their way of life, because every treaty that they worked with the United States government were immediately broken, never followed through, and they were immediately conquered and put onto this concentration camp where eventually they're all put onto river boats, sent down the Mississippi River, and then sent up the Missouri River, and then put on trains and dropped off at a new reservation called Crow Creek, which is where some of my family comes from. And it's a really intense time period. And, you know, it's just, again, like we just see this over and over again throughout the history, especially in the 1860s. And a lot of this violence happens during Lincoln's situation. This is a flyer that was put up in Denver, Colorado, trying to get militia, because if you follow U.S. military history, like we don't even have a full form of military up until the Civil War, because a lot of this out west was all militia, you know, and militia-based military is really the history of United States military when it comes down to it. Sorry, it's just like they're relying on people to sign up for a lot of this stuff. So a lot of the things they would get said this company will be entitled to all horses and plunder taken from the Indians, and this leads to the Sand Creek Massacre, where they just wipe out an entire village. And there's so many situations like this throughout that 1860s through 1870s, and even like, you know, Wounded Knee, which happened just a few miles from where I grew up, is in 1890. So we were still fighting the U.S. government until almost the end of that century. So loss of food access is really, you know, what happens throughout this time period. The United States government also decides that it was going to be cheaper to wipe out some of their food sources than to wipe out all natives. And there's actual like arguments in Congress about whether to commit all-out genocide and take everybody out, but they finally settle on just destroying foodways, you know. So one thing that they do is to start attacking the bison that are out there on the plains, because so many of those western tribes were utilizing bison as a main source of food, for tools, for weapons, and lodging, and all sorts of things, right? So they set out and do, you know, this over a very short period of time, and there's things that you can find in the history that it's just a very racist policies. It's very intentional, because a lot of us learn how the American bison was almost extinct, but they don't talk about how it was intentional from the U.S. government. So there's snippets like this. In 1874, United States surveying parties report that there are 2,000 hunters on the plains killing these animals for their hides. One party of 16 hunters report having killed 28,000 bison in the past summer alone. And that's just the way, because they're paying people to take out this whole situation. And growing up Lakota, we had stories about trying to understand what was happening and why the bison were disappearing, and not knowing really what was going on, you know. So it was because we couldn't have ever dreamt that something like that could just take out an complete species that were like our relatives when it comes down to it. But what's most damaging to us as Indigenous peoples was really just the eradication of our own education systems. Because if you take a moment to define Indigenous education was thousands of generations being handed down, giving us the blueprints to live sustainably, utilizing primarily plant knowledge when it comes down to it. So we just were able to utilize the world around us, as so many of our ancestors were able to do. But during this time period, you know, at the end of that century and the end of all of that violence in the 1800s, we start going through assimilation efforts. So if anybody has ever been to Pennsylvania, there's a boarding school there called Carlisle Indian School. It's now a war college. But my grandparents' generation of these children, they should have been downloading all of those thousands of generations of knowledge, giving them really valuable and important information. But instead, they're forced onto these boarding schools, and it's really not a fun place for these kids to be, because it's a military-run school. They go through a lot of harsh punishments. They face a lot of physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse, and a lot of that trauma is still active in a lot of our communities today. We're still seeing that same kind of trauma and abuse in our communities. Mental abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic abuse, you name it, and it's all coming from this very generation right here of setting the tone. And these kids in this picture, they're coming from so many different nations across the board. A lot of them are trained out to Pennsylvania. And it's you know, when I went there, the historian that was on site at Carlisle said one of the things they would do is if kids were caught speaking their language or singing music in their language, that they'd be forced to brush their teeth with pumice stones. And these are just little tiny kids, you know. And My grandparents are this generation. So these boarding schools go on for quite a while. My mom went to boarding school in South Dakota, and she doesn't talk about it because she went through she witnessed a lot of the same kind of abuse that was happening. And you know, this is happening all over what is the United States, Hawaii, Alaska. In Canada, they call them residential schools. Some of you might have seen some of the news coming out over the past few years about them starting to look at the grounds around some of these residential schools and finding all sorts of unmarked graves from very young children, because parents knew this was happening because their kids would be grabbed from their families and taken to school, and they would never see them again, ever. And they just didn't always know why, but they knew what was happening, but they could never prove it. But now it's starting to really come out to the intense trauma that went on with these schools. So a few years back in 2019, right before some of that searching happens, one group in, I believe, Ontario did a ceremony, and what they did is they wrote down the name of every single student they can find in the Canadian residential schools, not including the US boarding schools, but just up in Canada, and they made a banner with every single name they can find. But now knowing this is just a small percentage of the names that are out there. So I think it's really important to just watch the ceremony for a second and just think about all the names that are on this banner. And like, we shouldn't have to worry that if we send our kids off to school, whether they come back alive or not, but this was the harsh reality for a lot of Indigenous communities. And that's just some of the reality that we faced as Indigenous peoples during the turn of the century. So how are we doing in the 1900s? You know, the 1900s, after that one century of 1800 to 1900, which was a really intense and very violent century for us, you know, we aren't official citizens until 1924, which is after my grandparents are born. And first they allow some of the males to be citizens, and then some of the females to be citizens after that. At that same time, at that same year, the United States government realized it didn't have rules or regulations to segregate Indigenous peoples. It only knew how to segregate black and white. So they had to create a new situation called the Racial Integrity Act in 1924. And if you follow more history, when the Nazi Party in Germany was looking around to see what other countries had created legislation around segregation and racial policies, they of course stumbled upon the United States as being one of the very few that actually passed laws around the situation, but thought they were too harsh, which is really pretty crazy. But it's true though, because we were not good back then at all. We go through a couple decades of Indian termination and relocation policies, which we see a lot of urban Indigenous communities arise in places like Chicago, Minneapolis, Oakland, Denver. And we go through another quite a bit of period where 1941 to 1967, which we call the Indian adoption era, which should get more review because it's a really intense situation. But during this time period, which is a long period of time, right? It's almost 3 decades. 1 out of 3 Indigenous children are pulled from their families and put into non-Indigenous homes, which is just another form of cultural genocide because they're just further whitewashing and assimilating us as Indigenous peoples. That's a big number, 1 out of 3 kids during almost 3 decades in a very recent history. You know, some of it, there's quite a few people here that were alive during that time period. We can't vote like many people of color until 1965, and we're still battling that situation. Growing up in South Dakota, we couldn't vote until the 80s because they wouldn't accept votes from unorganized counties. Now they're just gerrymandering everything when it comes down to it. We couldn't celebrate our own religions until 1978 legally. So many of our knowledge keepers and knowledge holders were imprisoned before that just because they knew too much about the cultures. So a lot of our tribes went into hiding and secrecy when it came to any kinds of ceremonies or any kind of practices. And there's still a high level of uncomfortableness when we talk about ceremonies. It's just a really rough time, especially with a country who, wears the freedom of religion on its sleeve so much, just except for Native people, the original people of this land space. So post-colonial Native America, what does that look like? We've never actually even exited a situation of colonialism. We're still living in an era of colonialism. There's still indigenous peoples in Brazil being killed right now today, and it's happening around the world, So we still have a lot of work to do. And, during this last election, they couldn't even remember who we were as indigenous people. They just called us something else. And that was going to be our slogan, come down to Owamni, we're something else, right? So for me, I grew up, like I said earlier, on Commodity Foods, which is a program that was originally set up to help a lot of the settlers that had that had spread out across the Midwest where all of the farming was going on. And after the Great Depression, they were trying to set up systems to support them. So the U.S. government starts buying surplus from a lot of these farms to create its own surplus of foods that it could use for hospitals, school systems, universities, military, and the indigenous communities that were still out there because of a lot of the treaties. So this food program, unfortunately, is not very healthy, because it's a lot of over-salted vegetables, over-sugared fruits, a lot of carbs. Growing up with government bran flakes and government powdered milk is not that fun. It's just not that, the food system is just not that good. And, we didn't even have fancy labels like that when I was growing up. We just had the government cans that would say pork with juices and beef with juices and chicken with juices. And it's that with juices that really, makes that product really good, but no, it's awful. And Indian tacos or fry bread tacos, they're great. They're not going to go anywhere. They're a really fun dish that we came up with. But it really comes down to that, it was something that was taught to us because we were given staples that aren't ours. We were given lard and flour and salt and things like that. So this has become a really great piece for us to celebrate. But it shouldn't be the one piece that identifies us all as indigenous peoples, because we have so much amazing diversity to showcase, which is why I chose in my business to showcase something different, Just be a little bit what else, what could we do that really focuses on the amazing diversity that we have as indigenous peoples. So that's where it comes to understanding how indigenous food systems work. So the first thing you have to do is just think about what's out there, So I spent a lot of time contemplating, researching, reading, digging through everything, and just looking through histories and ethnobotanical texts. But it's really pretty simple to think about, because first, just look at North America, if we're just going to focus on this continent. They're so diverse in just the ecoregions, right? We've got everything from Arctic to tropics. We've got plains and mountains and coastal regions and swamps, all sorts of temperate and growing zones. And there's just so much biodiversity out there in plants and animals. And when you layer indigenous peoples on top of it, one way to see that is through a language map. So if you look at the indigenous language maps of North America, there's a lot of indigeneity out there. So that's why we get excited, because then we imagine driving across this nation in any direction, stopping at indigenous-focused businesses and experiencing all that amazing cultural and food diversity that's out there, That will be the fun part. And knowing that these are giant blocks that are very vague, and within those huge color blocks, there's still a lot of subdialects and even other languages. It's hard to even map all of the diversity that's out there. So today there's 634 tribes in Canada, 574 in the U.S., 228 of those tribes are all in Alaska. We were just in Alaska a month ago, and Alaska, for the first time in history, officially recognized its own tribes in that one state. It hadn't done it ever up until that point. There's 20% of Mexico that identifies as indigenous, which is a huge population. So there's a lot of indigeneity alive out there. So why don't we have so many amazing indigenous restaurants, right? And it's easy, if you look at colonial settler states compared to indigenous regions, there's no comparison. There's just so much diversity, and that's what we should be focused on, is celebrating diversities, not homogenizing and whitewashing everything, but really focused on the true roots of what is North America. And, and it doesn't matter who's speaking Spanish, English, or French. Those are all foreign languages. Those are European colonial languages, right? English is a foreign language to this land space. We should really just be focused on preserving a lot of the indigeneity that the United States government and other governments spent so much time trying to wipe out, because we have to save it. Nobody else is going to do it. So Indigenous education is a really important part to this, because the westernized education has never really focused on really truly understanding where we are and the plant life around us and utilizing it. There's so much that we should be utilizing in our diets. Indigenous peoples use so many diverse plant species in their diets because they had thousands of generations teaching them how to do that. Where the Western diet, most people are eating very little diversity at all, because you go to the store and you buy the same stuff: some lettuce, some tomatoes, some carrots, some garlic. And most people stop counting the diversity of the things they're buying by the time they're in their 20s, in the counting to 20s and stuff. So we could just do so much better. So understanding Indigenous knowledge, there's a lot to this. It's a study of all these pieces: wild foods, permaculture, agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, whole animal butchery, mycology, salt, sugar, fat productions, crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, Indigenous metallurgy, histories, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, you name it. We have so much to teach about from an Indigenous perspective, no matter where you are in the world. So going through some of these lessons, like animals is the easy piece, right? Anything that's literally moving around can be broken down. And one thing we do learn in school is that they would generally, in a very general term speaking, say Native Americans used every part of the bison, right? Which is true, but that's just because we had to be resourceful, and we had thousands of generations telling us what to do with every single part of it. And we had that same mentality for animals and plants, because we had figured out what to do with all the byproducts, So we shouldn't be afraid of eating animals if it doesn't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because those animals didn't even exist on this land space not that long ago. So we try to utilize a lot of alternative proteins just to showcase that. And there's a lot of good food out there, as we know, and we can be a little bit better about the protein choices that we utilize. Even insects at my restaurant, Owamni in Minneapolis, I'm going through about 15 pounds of crickets a week, which is a lot of crickets because they don't weigh that much, right? And it's just exciting for people to try something different because you can make them taste good. And it's normal in so many other cultures. But what really, for me, helped me touch base with my ancestry was plant knowledge, because that was one of the biggest keys, because plants are everything to us. It's food, medicine, lodging, crafting. So many of our stories and mythologies and religions come from plants, and we still are lucky that we have a lot of our ceremonies, our songs, and all the things that we do to connect with the plants around us. Having a relationship with plants is extremely, extremely important. I've been teasing lately that most of our kids can name more of Kim Kardashian's ex-boyfriends than they can tree species, right? And we should be really better about what kind of education we're teaching people, especially young people, and especially getting people excited about what's outside. Can you identify trees if you walked around campus? At our restaurant, we just put signs up everywhere. So you'll see a sign by something, it'll have the Dakota name of that, because that's the true name of that plant and that soil. Then the English name, and then a little description of what people utilized it for. And it would be so easy just to put all of that all around us, so you just see it all the time and start to create a connection and learn the names of where you are, and taking it that far to learn the true names of those plants in that soil, which are the native names of whatever land space you might be on. Because when you start seeing food, when you start seeing plants for what they are, and understanding what is my relation with this plant, how do I connect with this plant? Every single plant out there has a purpose, right? And we can learn how to utilize it and live with it. And you start to see all of it all around you. It's just food and medicine and crafting. It's always right there, right outside your window. And we could be better at that. And understanding that as humans, we just need basic building blocks to survive. What kind of carbohydrates were people utilizing? So for me, growing up, we harvested this plant called Timsala, which is a prairie turnip. It's a wild turnip. And that was really typical. You can still find it in a lot of Lakota homes. But there's other plants out there like camas root in the Great Basin, Pacific Northwest, and even into California. Or where I'm at in Minnesota, we have true wild rice, which is nothing like the black wild rice that you find in the grocery stores. But wild rice even used to grow all the way out into these regions, but we've destroyed so much of its habitat. And now climate change is taking it out too, because it's slowly receding northward because it likes the cold, cold waters, and the waters are getting really warm now. So we're seeing less and less of it. But sea plants in general, like coastal tribes had a vast knowledge of plants around them, including what was right off on the shore, and were able to utilize that because, again, they had thousands of generations to figure out what to do with everything around here, wherever you might be. And it's that same mentality. You can follow it around the globe. It's not just Native Americans, but indigenous peoples globally had this kind of knowledge. And that's what's exciting, is trying to figure all that stuff out. Or if you're in the desert where all the plants look like they want to hurt you and maim you, you know, these plants have very specific purposes, and the indigenous communities out there were very comfortable with these plants. And it's silly to use a term like food desert, because people who lived in the desert saw nothing but food around them. They just knew how to look. They just knew what their relation was with those plants. North American indigenous agriculture is something that should be taught more, because so many of the world's crops have come from the Americas, and we're taught to think that we're kind of at the pinnacle and the highest point of modern agriculture, but we know what this kind of agriculture is actually doing to soil, and the monocultural crops with the amount of chemicals that goes into these kinds of soils is really damaging, because this chemical is not only in all of this food that it's producing, but it's also getting into the soil, getting into our waterways, getting into our towns, getting into our houses, getting into ourselves. And we're not going to even know what's going to happen to us for a little while longer till we find out what happens to an entire generation of people who have been microdosing things like glyphosate over and over again, because you can't get away from it. It's in everything. It's like in all the products in the middle of your grocery store. It's so hard to get away, but you don't want to mess with that stuff. That stuff's scary, And so we should just be learning from people who had giant civilizations and immense amount of agriculture. If anybody's ever been down to the Yucatan, the Mayan Empire had so much amazing agriculture, so much science, so much architecture, so much, and they didn't need chemicals. They were able to feed, hundreds of thousands of people with this kind of stuff, and they're growing things like corns, beans, squash, chili peppers, sunflowers, cotton, tobacco, and you see the same thing moving northward. So, Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, when they first stumble upon Mexico City, they're growing raised bed gardens, and their waterways are pristinely clean. And again, they have, hundreds of thousands of peoples living across this area right now, and they were able to support that all through organic indigenous agricultural practices. And you can keep following indigenous agriculture up. This is in New Mexico. It's a Zuni farm where they figured out how to do a waffle system farming technique. And because there's so much, again, diversity within indigenous communities, there wasn't just one way to farm. It's not like, how did Native Americans farm? That's just too broad. There's too many people, too many different cultures. People figured out many ways to farm. So, but being able to farm and create water systems in the middle of the desert, to do that for thousands of years, that's pretty sweet. And a lot of us know, if you're studying agriculture, about three sisters systems, where you grow the corn, and the beans crawl up the corn, and the squash helps protect the outer layers from other plants and things. But this is a very regional farming technique that's from these regions out this way, right? Because again, we're so diverse. There's this one. This is in modern-day North Dakota. You can see the Missouri River in the background. This woman is named Buffalo Birdwoman. There's a book out there called Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden. She's a Hidatsa woman, and this book chronicles her memories growing up a Hidatsa farmer, all the different seeds that she's using. She's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe, antler rakes, and she gets to write about just everything she remembers growing up before she ever saw European people. And it's a really amazing book because it's a really rare book on indigenous agriculture, but it's even more rare because it's coming from a female perspective, and females never make it into history books, especially women of color. So it's just a really cool book to find if you're really focused on this study. Because you have to remember that every one of these seeds comes from very particular people, very particular places, and there's so much power and story behind these seeds, and communities had tried so hard to bring seeds with them. whenever they're going. People braiding seeds in their hair coming from Africa, or on the long marches like the Trail of Tears, just to have, like, because these are our family members, you know, these are our ancestors too, and you have to continue to grow them. They're living beings, you know. I've been to museums like the Field Museum in Chicago, where they showed me they had over 100,000 cobs of corn in their basement from the turn of the century, but they never grew them out. They just kept them in boxes in the basement, and now they can't germinate, you know? So we lost so much biodiversity of just not knowing what we're doing and not taking care of things. So we have to be better, and we have to allow these seeds to stay in the hands of indigenous peoples who have the true relations and connections and stories behind these seeds, because there's a lot of big chemical and seed companies out there trying to buy up all the world's seeds because they just want power. They just want to control the food systems. But we have to maintain this cultural heritage through seeds. You know, it's a really important part because there's so much amazing diversity in the seeds out there. And there's so much of what is the U.S. that was agricultural, because agriculture, especially corn culture, starting in the bottom of Mexico, Belize regions, shooting both directions, north and south, going all throughout Mexico, throughout the whole Caribbean, throughout the eastern seaboard, past us, up into parts of Canada, all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, and all that space in between. So much agriculture was in North America, and our history books don't like to teach us that. They like to teach us that it was just wide open spaces, you know, and beautiful wheat fields, which is so far from the truth. So we just have to realize that somebody has to help protect this, and it has to be this generation. Like, nobody else, again, is going to do this work. So understanding what to do with all this knowledge is what we've been trying to figure out. Like, how do we pay homage as modern indigenous peoples to our ancestors, to respect their foodways, to learn their lessons, you know? And the foods that we're doing, we're not trying to cook like it's 1491. We're trying to just understand as much knowledge and information from our ancestors and apply it to now so we can be something bigger, you know? We went through that really intense century of violence in the 1800s, a really segregated and racist century of the 1900s to 2000s, and now I feel like we're finally walking into a century of reclamation where our youth have access to all sorts of education, and we can start moving forward and practicing our ways and bringing it into the next generation and being the stewards that needed to happen the last couple centuries. But we're at this space now, and we're seeing it out there. We're seeing more and more indigenous communities starting to, you know, really think about food sovereignty and food security issues and reclaiming culture through foodways. It has to happen. You know, so for us, when we started doing this work, we just started doing it. Just go outside, learn the plants, you know. We have all these little smartphones in our pockets, and you can literally download an app and point it at a plant, and it'll tell you what it is with pretty high accuracy. You know, and we should be doing everything we can to learn as much as possible and just start seeing food everywhere, you know. We should just be having it all over the place and taking the time to create our own pantries, make food taste like where we are. You know, because if you looked, you know, we travel a lot, and we can almost write the menu for every restaurant we go to walking into it, because it's always the same. You know, you're going to have your Caesar salad, you're going to have a burger, you're going to have bourbon bacon something on your burger, you're going to have, like, you know, it's just like you can write out the menu. And we need more diversity, and we need more regional diversity, and we could do that with indigenous communities because they're the ones that truly know the land space the best, especially with the wild foods around those regions and the stories behind them, because food with story is so important, you know. And it's fun to make food taste like where you happen to be, and utilizing flavors that you aren't going to find some of these flavors in the grocery stores, you know. Because when I first started doing this work, people would be like, hey, where can I, you know, I'd have chefs calling me up and being like, hey, where can I find some white cedar? I was like, or no, they'd ask me something like, where could I find some balsam or Douglas fir? It's like, well, you have to go to the Pacific Northwest. They're like, no, where can I buy it? It's like, I don't think you can. Like, they're like, well, where do I get it? It's like, you have to go outside. But she's like, where at? It's like, I'm in South Minneapolis. Where should I go? Pacific Northwest. Like, they just become so disconnected, you know. And, you know, you start to see some wild foods in the co-ops and grocery stores sometimes. I know one of the classes was watching a video where I was talking about the spruce tips, because it's a good example. It's like, I always see the spruce tips come into our co-op early in the spring, and they're being shipped all the way from the Pacific Northwest, and they're like $30 for a pound, you know. And they look nice, they're fresh, But then you literally go outside and there'll be a spruce tree right there with them all over them. And we're just so disconnected. We think we have to pay for food when we don't. Food doesn't have to have a monetary value. We can grow food, we can harvest food. But again, like, we have to understand how to do it sustainably. You can't just run rampant and harvest wild foods without knowing how plants work. You have to understand it, and understand that indigenous communities that lived off of a lot of wild plants did it with a lot of intention. They helped plants grow. They helped groves and forests grow with plants and fields grow, and they knew how to harvest things sustainably, making sure to leave some for the next generation of that plant's life cycle and leave some for the animals and birds that need to thrive off of it, and putting so much respect into it with prayers and songs and offerings every time they gathered, so much deep respect. And so we need to get to that level where we can understand that. But we can also, just continue to move forward. And as chefs, it's fun to play with food. It's fun to make things taste good and look pretty, We try to keep everything really simple because, again, like, we cut out dairy products, wheat flour, cane sugar, typically beef, pork, and chicken, and just really focus on the foods around us. And making desserts without butter, cream, and sugar. Like, that sounds tough, but it's totally doable. We can be creative with that. And plus, because of removing all those colonial ingredients, we're gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free. We're like what every diet's trying to get to, and it's just the diet of North America. And it's fun because it's diverse, There's a lot to explore there. And, oops, doubled up. But this is a picture of rabbit, white cedar, cranberries, wild rice, maple. And you can literally just stand on one spot in Minnesota and look around and see all those ingredients right there. Like, you should just make food taste like where you are, That's regional diversity, and there's so much we can to work towards, and keeping things simple is good, It's fun to let food be food. You don't have to go through all sorts of processing. Modern food is fun and interesting, but we don't have to make a foam out of everything and make smoke out of it and all these kinds of, it's smoke and mirrors, Really good food makes you feel good, and I've been to lots of fancy dinners, and they're not always that satisfying because sometimes you just want some good food, Food should just be that simple. And for us, we just really want to get this food back into tribal communities who just don't have access to their own foods and haven't for a long time. It's typically only some of the elders that really remember some of these flavors that we're playing with. And it's been going away because they just get so much processed food. So that's why we set up systems to help build that. We want to reclaim indigenous health and culture through food, which is why I started my nonprofit. Because we just want to see this food get back into tribal communities, get away from the reliance on government who's never taken care of us as indigenous peoples, and to offset things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, heart disease, all of that stuff that's just been that's too prevalent in a lot of our communities. Some of our indigenous communities have up to 60% type 2 diabetes within the community because of the low nutritional access. And it shouldn't be your zip code that tells you how much nutritional access you get to have. Everybody should have access to foods when it comes down to it. Some of the first businesses I started, like the Tatanka truck in Minneapolis, we didn't do fry bread, and we didn't know if we were just going to piss off every native in the city because it was a cool looking native truck. But we did something different and it worked, We just used a lot of corn product. We made open-faced corn tacos. We made white cedar and maple tea. And we just did everything. And everything happened to be really healthy and tasty and good. And that helped us move forward, So I created the Sous Chef in 2014 with that focus of trying to do that. And the nonprofit is called NATIFS, which is the acronym North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And under NATIFS, I developed two focuses, which is creating access to indigenous foods and creating access to indigenous education, which are kind of the two fronts the U.S. government used against us because they took our food away from us and they tried to assimilate us. So using these two fronts can be really impactful for us moving forward. And through this, we made Indigenous Food Lab, which is in Minneapolis, and we're just finishing our first model now. So Indigenous Food Lab has been a commercial kitchen where we're able to do a lot of food relief. So we actually moved into our space that we're in now in early 2020, and we were about ready to sign a lease, and we were originally going to have a restaurant attached to Indigenous Food Lab, but then the pandemic rolled out, so we had to pull back a little bit and wait. And then just a couple months later, George Floyd incident happened just a few blocks from our kitchen, and we had to again do something because the whole city was up in arms. People were really mad, and every building around us just got completely burned down during the protests and the social uprising that happened. So we just started doing a lot of food relief. And for a little while we were doing 10,000 meals a week with a staff of about a dozen people and utilizing a lot of volunteer work. But now we're finally able to start setting up the model for what it was supposed to be. So Indigenous Food Lab has that commercial kitchen with a lot of ability to cook a lot of food if we need to. We use it as a commissary kitchen for the restaurant, so we sell a lot of food to the restaurant, so the restaurant's always purchasing and pushing money towards the nonprofit to make our staff a little bit more sustainable. We have a market that's getting ready to open, so it'll be a place for our community to come and buy Indigenous food products made by Indigenous food producers. And then we also have a community classroom where we can start teaching about Indigenous education topics and curriculum, everything from food preservation and cooking techniques and language and arts and history and speakers and whatever we want. But we're also investing in a lot of digital equipment so we can record everything and make everything accessible online so everybody has access to it. And just really rethinking and working, so we have a full education department at the nonprofit to start working on Indigenous education, Indigenous curriculum, and looking at education from that Indigenous perspective, because so long, still today, so much of our education and academia is still from a very Western perspective, and we need to showcase that peoples from all over the world have equal knowledge that is really valuable everywhere. And we need to focus on trying to harness that and steward that and just really, make that accessible to people to give us more perspectives of education that are out there. And, benefits of a healthy diet, Indigenous diet, are healthier fats, more diverse proteins, low carbs, low salts, an immense plant diversity, organic agricultures, cultural regional diversities, regional and seasonal based food systems, and community-based food systems, really, when it comes down to it, because that's how people survived. Food systems here in North America didn't have monetary value. People just worked really hard as an entire community. Everybody in that community did something to help with the food system, whether you're gathering, growing, seed saving, building tools, hunting, fishing, trapping, whatever you might be doing, teaching the youth how to do and the next generation. Everybody played a role in the food system one way or another, so the entire community had enough food to get through the entire year. And so as we work towards Indigenous food sovereignty, we need these things to happen to get us to a true point of food security. We need healthy food access, we need cultural food producers, regional food systems, local control of food systems, which means non-governmental, access to Indigenous education, and environmental protections, which is why you see so many Indigenous communities standing up to fight for environmental protections, because when you're fighting, when we've been fighting with Standing Rock and some of the pipelines in Minnesota, it's not a matter of if those pipelines leak, but when and how much damage will they leave behind, and will our grandchildren have access to some of these foods, Because for so long, there's been so little regulation around these kinds of things because that was part of the colonial machine. It's about extraction for profit, And we have to change our mentality when it comes to that situation. Because these pipelines have leaked all over the United States, and they continue to do so. So it's just, we need to be so much better when it comes to this kind of situation. And we just really want to push for more community gardens, and we want to push for permaculture because we can landscape any way we want to, We have that ability, so why are we wasting our time on lawns, right? Somebody said that turf is one of the biggest commodities in Rhode Island. Like, that's crazy, right? We should be focusing on food because grass does nothing, right? Like, we should just be really focused on where we are because lawns are stupid. They're really stupid, And we just need, to see, I put this up the other day because we were talking in Jackson Hole, and there's a lot of golfers there. There's probably some golfers in this room. No offense to golfers. But why do we need 120 golf courses in Palm Springs? That makes no sense. That place is in the middle of the desert, and, it shouldn't look like that. The desert shouldn't look like a green grass oasis, If we have that much technology, that much financial resource to make something look like that, just imagine what we could do if we just put food everywhere, Like, that's just such a waste to me. And plus, we're going through, such intense water situations, and it's only getting worse, and will continue to get worse and worse as we grow. So, there's just no reason that we should be wasting all that precious water resource on something like this, We don't need 120 golf courses in the middle of the desert, but that's where we are. And it's, you know how California is just going through so much drought and wildfire, and we're just allowing that to constantly happen. We're allowing companies like Nestle to suck up billions of gallons of water on a daily basis all over North America for the purpose of making plastic water bottles, right? And we could just do so much better. The Oglala Aquifer is one of North America's largest bodies of water. It goes all the way from Texas up into South Dakota. So when I was growing up on Pine Ridge, we were tapping into the northern edge of that. But even that is starting to dry up because we're allowing companies to go unregulated and abuse it. Nestle is spending like $500 licenses on a year to suck out as much water as they want. There's just zero regulation on that kind of stuff. So we have to change that. So our goal is just trying to become a support system to help and develop more Indigenous food entrepreneurs. We want to replicate our Indigenous food lab model and put it in cities all over the place. So each Indigenous food lab could be that regional center point to help develop more Indigenous food operations, whether it's on a tribal community, whether it's entrepreneurs, whatever it might be. We just want to develop a support system that doesn't exist right now and help see more of that through. And we want to work with a lot more universities because universities have such great resources to help really curb and change the future and really get the next generation of leaders involved into some of the solution making that we have coming up. And we can help. We can work with the universities with their food service operations, getting them to start to normalize Indigenous food offerings in some of the cafeterias and food service operations that they have. We can do the same thing with tribal communities. We can work with their community centers, elder centers, help them to develop menus and recipes that's particular to the region, and hopefully getting them to purchase more and more Indigenous food products from Indigenous food producers regionally first, just to help spur a lot more economic activity amongst Indigenous growers out there. And that stuff's all doable. But we also need trained kitchens to help us understand. Universities could be working with us on our educational level and helping us learn more and steward this knowledge and work on just understanding, work on research, work on finding, just trying to understand better as we move forward in the future, and training the next generation of what kind of tools and equipment do we need, because we need trained kitchens and culinary people too, just to know what to do with all this wild food, Because imagine if we just took one giant lawn on campus and just put food everywhere on it, and how much that one half acre somewhere could produce. Like that, it could produce so much food if we just put our minds to it. And all of that food pantry that comes out of it could help supplement some of this stuff, and at the same time, it's great education for people working on it. And we can do that in communities too. And we want to see a lot more Indigenous food production and food producers. So we also set up ourselves to get a USDA licensing so we can be a micro to mid-size co-packer, so we can help people get some of their cottage industry products on the market better. Because if you try to go into a co-packer, let's say you're making something and you want to do it and sell it in a grocery store, you have to find a co-packer, you have to spend a lot of money, and you have to have a lot of product to get to that point. And it's a huge hurdle that most people just don't have to get to that point. And it's a gamble because the quality when you go to that level gets dropped down quite a bit, and you have to cut a lot of costs, and it just doesn't come out the way you want it to. But so we just want to figure out ways to do that. So we're working with a pilot program right now with an Indigenous group in Minneapolis who grew out a whole bunch of heirloom Native American squash. We processed for it, and we're going to be packing it for them this winter and creating a product for them that they're calling IndigiBaby. And we're going to be able to do that all through our processing. And we'll see if it works. We hope it does. Because if we just believe that if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, which is what our Indigenous ancestors had done for so long. Don't let other people control your food, because then you're always in debt to them, right? We need to work on this as a community with the ones we love, the ones we trust, to be able to get there. So the restaurant for me isn't about myself. It isn't about trying to become a famous chef. We do get a lot of accolades, but that just helps me become something, it helps me become a vehicle to share this message with you, That's what it's really about. The restaurant's just a proof of concept that we can have a decolonized, healthy restaurant, and it could be popular, And we hired 120, I think we had 120 employees this last summer. And we were pretty close to probably 70% of us identifying as Indigenous or one way or another. And it's just not typical to find that, especially Indigenous peoples. We don't get to go to a restaurant, see our Native names on the menu, hear our Native music, see people that look like us cooking the food, and it's not normal. So we're trying to do something that's different, and we're hoping that we can see more and more of these. So I hope you guys support Sherry with her endeavors out here, because we need more of this, you know. And, you know, we named the restaurant after what is downtown Minneapolis. There used to be a really beautiful waterfall called, the Dakota people called it Owamni-Yamni, which meant place of the falling, swirling water. And we just took the short name because Owamni-Yamni is kind of a mouthful. So people would just say the short name Owamni, but that's just reclaiming the namespace of the space that we happen to be on right downtown, what is now Minneapolis. Because when the colonial machine moved into what is Minneapolis, they built all these mills, they're processing all the logs and lumber, they're processing all of the wheat and things like that. And because of all that mill stuff, it ruined this really delicate ecosystem and soil of where the waterfalls were. So now there's just concrete skirtings there, and it doesn't look the same. But we feel very lucky that our first big project happens to be on this very sacred site. The name for the Mississippi in Dakota is Hahawakpa, which means River of the Falls, because this was the one big waterfall on the Mississippi, and it's like the heart of the Mississippi, so we feel very lucky to be right there. And again, just like some of the intentionality of what we do, so we try to purchase from Indigenous producers first, locally, then nationally, and we just want to drive a lot of money back into Indigenous food production, and we are, and it's working right now. And there's so much creativity can come of this, right? You know, it's so fun to be able to challenge ourselves to create what is modern Indigenous foods moving forward, because we can do whatever we want to do. You know, we chose a very specific path. We can have fry bread, we can do whatever we want. We just have to identify it. We just need Indigenous peoples to have that time and moment to identify what their foods are and what their food systems are, because so often we get European chefs discovering and claiming things like, I just discovered the foods of Oaxaca, you know, and that's just dangerous language, number one. But we just need Indigenous peoples to be able to rise up and voice what they are. They're the ones that are the true knowledge keepers of those foods, you know. So we need to see more people in the BIPOC just level having that ability to showcase this food. So it's not just European chefs making this, you know, distilling this food for other, you know, European descendants. We need BIPOC people to really rise up and celebrate this diversity and showcase it, because they're the ones that really get it, you know. So we just want to see that happen, and we just truly believe that on a global scale, the future is Indigenous. It has to be if we're going to save this earth, if we're going to feed ourselves, and if we're going to be able to move forward with this world, you know, because we have to be better connected. We have to protect the earth. We have to stop thinking about extracting everything for profit, you know, and we have to learn how to get together. Let's feed each other, you know. It should be that easy, but, you know, we have a lot of struggles to get there. So that's my talk. Thanks. And then, did you want to do any Q&A or anything like that? Are we good with
We can try for one question.
One question.
The boss says one
Multiple
question.
choice.
I
One
know
question.
we have to kind of get out of here by 8:20, so
Okay.
anybody.
We have 1 minute then. But if you guys do make it to Owamni, you know, it's been very popular. We've been open since last July, so we're still pretty new, but we've been sold out every single day that we open. So it's really hard, and people are always asking, how do I get a reservation? And I just say, I don't know, I just grew up on one.
That's awesome. Very intense, very eye-opening. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you guys so much for listening.
Sure you don't have one question? Are you sure? Okay. Hold on. So people, just, we want to hear you.
Sure. If I'm looking for native foods in this area, what resources should I use?
The outdoors.
Okay.
No, obviously, you know, there's a lot of tribal communities, and you know, supporting Indigenous, any kind of production, especially restaurants, which can really, because, you know, Sherry's going to be bringing in ingredients from different peoples and showcasing that. Working with some of the projects with the tribes, especially around food sovereignty, will be really important. Some foods we're just not going to see on the market. You know, that's just the way it's going to be, and that's okay, because some foods we might only get to try if we're on an Indigenous community, like during a ceremony or a very particular time of year. You know, and that's just fine. We don't have to have everything at the grocery store. So it's just a matter of just being open, learning the plants around us better, learning who's growing some of these Indigenous products. What's that? Yeah, download an app if you want to identify things more. But just starting to reconnect with your area, learning the histories, learning the violence and hardships that Indigenous peoples went through just to understand. And, you know, there's a lot we can do to move forward.
Yeah. In Charleston.
Sherry, do you want to can you let Sherry,
Yeah.
here, give her the microphone.
Yeah, we'll advertise it. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm located right down the street, 4349 South County Trail in Charlestown. It's called Sly Fox Den 2. It used to be called the Old Gentleman Farmer or the Old Mill Diner. Come on in. We'd love to serve you some indigenous food.
Thank you, Sherry. And also, we are going to have a food truck next week on Tuesday, serving some indigenous foods.
Great.
And it will be on the quad. We're working on it. And also be here next week for Ashante Reese talking about Black foods. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Sean, again.
Thank you, guys.